cover both the context behind why we're doing the Futures Forum on Learning, some of the exciting announcements and updates we have, as well as to learn from an incredible set of experts over the next hour. So I would welcome the ability for everyone who's joining us to introduce themselves in the chat feature. Give your name, your organization, and something you hope to get out of this conversation, which we'll track. And hopefully our speakers during the panel can respond. And if everyone can stay on mute, we'll get started. First up, I wanted to introduce Eric Braverman, the CEO of Schmidt Futures, to give us opening remarks on why we're gathered here today. Eric.
Thank you, Kumar, and thank you, Andreas, also for speaking this morning. Absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to the Futures Forum on Learning series. We came here to talk about what it would take to remedy the learning loss posed by COVID-19 as it relates to lifelong learning. It may be news to some of you to discover that the pandemic actually isn't over, which makes the question of what is it going to take to remedy learning loss a bit existential as you think about it. It turns out, I think, that really the pandemic has never been over, particularly as you look around the world and see the tremendous educational disparities and the disparities in testing, vaccine distribution, and the like. And if we're honest with ourselves, there was really a pandemic as it related to education before this pandemic for COVID-19. Years ago, I had the great privilege to teach in a classroom of underprivileged children, trying to use kind of pathetic, many generations ago computers to try to teach reading to young people in a poor community. And I will never forget a day that I asked one of the children who had a tremendous spirit. I said, what is the thing that is going to make it hardest for you to learn in this environment? And he said, well, there's nobody to read to me at home. My heart broke then, but it keeps breaking, because as we think about what that person's life might be, how we're going to imagine lifelong learning, the antecedents for these issues are long and deep, and they long precede the very pandemic that we're here to talk about. The good news for all of us here in the Futures Forum on Learning series is that we have some faith that change is possible. At Schmidt Futures, we bet on exceptional people making the world better, because one of our fundamental beliefs is that the solutions to the hardest problems in front of us in the world are out there in the imaginations and ideas of people all around the world, people who aren't connected, people we don't know, people who don't have the opportunity to come together and put forth the innovation that will make real change possible. In our program on learning engineering, which Kumar leads, we're focused on this exact question. What would it take to put more computer science into the science of learning and to drive continuous improvement? That's why we're all here. We think it is one of the solutions to the pandemic of educational disparity and the challenges of lifelong learning that we have in front of us. And in fact, we have some reason for optimism, which is that we have more tools than ever before. Imagine what's possible to connect students of any age to tutors that could help them with the technology that's available. Imagine how we can help people pass their tests, not just test to test, but to use new and clever ways of assessment. Imagine what it's going to take as we imagine continuous improvement to understand how well we're doing in a different way. So throughout the month, we're going to explore these topics and more. We're also deep in the midst of our second tools competition. We're really excited about this. Last year, we had more than 900 entrants, 18 winning teams that are on track to help more than 20 million students in the next few years. It was something we did together with Ken Griffin at Citadel. And I'm proud to say that in our new tools competition, which may well be the largest competition of its kind in the world, we now have an outstanding group of additional partners, including Ken Griffin once again, the Walton Family Foundation, the Siegel Family Endowment, the Overdeck Family Foundation, and the Gates Foundation. We expect to make more than $3 million of awards, more than double last year, and it might be more. So we have a lot of work ahead. We're optimistic about the possibility, but we're realistic about the challenge in front of us, a challenge that's posed by COVID-19, and frankly, a challenge that came long before it. So on behalf of all of us at Schmidt Futures, on behalf of our co-founders, Eric and Wendy Schmidt, we just couldn't be happier that you're here to do this work with us. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take more than all of us, with the people that are not here on this call that we need to bring into this work. And we're just excited to roll up our sleeves and get started. So thank you again for being here, and let's get to work.
Thank you, Eric. And, I think if I was to think about, your work and your career, you've been a real champion on how do we expand opportunity in everything you've done, and been a real champion on making sure this is a really important part of what Schmidt Futures is building. And I think it speaks to our sort of talent first thesis. So yeah, I'm excited about the work that's already happening, but I think the world is going through a ton, whether it's the continued world of sort of emergency that is COVID, that continues to rock everything, but also, whether it's the situation in Afghanistan, whether it's a range of our ongoing climate disaster. And so I think thinking about how we're building for that future is really important. The theme for today's discussion, as folks know, we're going to have 4 of these over the course of this month. Each of these deep dive sessions is built actually around one of the tracks of the tools competition. And so one of the tracks is around, how do we actually transform higher education and adult learning, sort of lifelong learning. And, I don't know if folks saw the story in the New York Times this morning, which sort of talked about, as we are talking about building back better and building, new infrastructure, do we actually have the set of folks with the right skills to actually take those jobs? I think that's just the beginning in the US context, but globally, what is the economy that we're building towards is a really important and hard question. So I think one of our goals with the tools competition track on higher ed and adult learning is, what are going to be the next set of ideas, and how do we use the learning engineering approach, using the best of computer science, using a continuous improvement approach. So I really hope folks bring questions and sort of drop them in the chat so that our panelists can engage with them. I hope you sort of follow up with us and the competition organizers follow up. And as Meg posted in the chat, after this 1-hour session, there's actually going to be an informal networking session that will continue on for folks who want to stick around, both on ideas they heard or questions they might have, because we really do want your ideas and all the other ideas for entering the tools competition. So, which will have a deadline, as Eric mentioned, for the end of the month. So with that, I wanted to sort of keep the conversation going on, like, why are we here? What is the opportunity? And I think, one person who can really help us, I've been sort of listening to Andreas and his, real focus on having a global perspective on what do educational systems need. I first interacted with him when I was in the Obama White House, when he sort of was the person that you'd go to say, well, how is the US doing versus other systems when it comes to education, when it comes to a broader notion of skills? And he's really expanded that into a broader notion of skills overall globally. So Andreas, I would love to have you sort of give us some of your opening thoughts as to what is the world economy that we're in right now, and where do you sort of, what would be your advice to folks who want to build new tools, new technological capabilities, but what are the challenges that they should tackle, and what are the traps they shouldn't fall into? Because one of our goals for these sessions is to really be provocative on that can help build towards better solutions. So with that, I'd love to welcome you onto the stage.
Thanks so much, Kumar. A really pleasure to be with you. And thanks so much for putting the spotlight on lifelong learning. During the COVID pandemic, everybody talks about school closures. And of course, that's been very dramatic. But the biggest dip that we have seen is not in initial learning, it's actually in lifelong learning. COVID has produced an unprecedented opportunity for people of all walks of life to learn. The kind of opportunities, digital opportunities, have dramatically expanded. But we've seen actually a 17% decline in the incidence and intensity of adult learning. Now think about this. At a time when we need it most, it's actually happening least. So I think that's something it's great to put this as a topic. And it's not just COVID, it's the whole context in which we are working. Digitalization has been incredibly democratizing. Everybody can collaborate, everybody can contribute, but it's also concentrating power at a rate that we've never seen before. And what makes it is the differentiator. It's the skills of people. Skilled technology has been incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. You post something on Twitter and the world can follow you, but it's also been incredibly homogenizing, squashing individual differences, raising questions around identity. Technology has been incredibly empowering. As you well know, the most successful companies these days are not created by the big industry, but by a big idea. They have the product before they get the money. But we're also seeing that technology can be incredibly disempowering. When we become the slaves of algorithms that we no longer understand. And where you are on this picture really is a direct consequence of your skill set. We see that in the workforce, in our companies, platform technology driving everything. The size of your company no longer depends on the number of people you have hired. With a few people, you can have a huge global footprint. We have put people with the right skills on a level playing field as we have never seen before. But I want to show you this. On the vertical axis, you see sort of the skills that we can measure well. It's about people's capacity to deal with numbers. On the horizontal axis, you see the risk of automation in countries. And you can basically put countries around a single line. Basically, if you have a poor skill set in your economy, you are most vulnerable to automation. Because those are the kind of jobs that are actually most easy to digitize, to automate. Now, the kind of things that are easy to teach, to test, they have become also easy to digitize and automate. If you put it up in a nutshell, basically, we've seen a decline in routine tasks, whether they are manual or cognitive. Now, I think the manual part, everybody's got, the robots, but actually the cognitive part, people often miss out. I think we're still very much educating people to reproduce the established knowledge of our times, not to put it into question. When we talk about lifelong learning, we should also talk about the capacity to actually unlearn and relearn when the context changes. Now we see a rise in technology intensity of tasks, and if you put the two things together, you get a pretty clear picture of the future of work. And interestingly, it works pretty much in every country of the OECD. So how well are we equipped? If you look at older people, 55 to 65-year-olds, you can see we just have about, 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 people. The United States and New Zealand are a little bit better positioned. Now there you can see the bars are a little bit longer, but you still talk just around, 20% of older workers being ready for the technologies that we do have now. I'm not talking about tomorrow or the future. I'm just talking about the world around us. Technology intensive industry. Now that shows you just, the urgency of lifelong learning. And now you may tell me, well, that's just about older workers not keeping up with new technologies. If you look at younger people, it's going to look a lot better. And in a way it does, the bars get longer among 25 to 34-year-olds, but not as much as you might think. You can look at the top country on the list, Finland. You still have 1/3, every third young person you're going to meet out in the street not being equipped for the world in which we live today. What's also interesting is the pace of change. I told you the United States was a front runner, 2 generations ago. That's reflected in the older kind of qualification cohort. If you look among younger people, things have improved, of course, but at a much lower rate than we have seen in countries, like Singapore, that used to be at the bottom, and it is now close to Finland and Sweden. So actually the relative pace of change countries moving forward has been incredibly different. But I think this issue of lifelong learning is very much illustrated by the right side. We're going to leave, the faster the world moves, the more we're going to leave older people behind, people who are not able to catch up. Some people call this a race between technology and education, and I think this is becoming a real issue for a lot of people. Now, many people think about this in a way, oh, technology is going to take opportunities away from people. But actually, our data at the OECD suggests quite the opposite. What's so interesting is that actually technology-intensive industries are much better at extracting value from the skills that people have. And it's not just about ICT skills, technology skills. Of course, that's the obvious part. But you can see this right across every skill category. You work in a technology-intensive sector, and you're going to get better paid for the same kind of work because the industry is just using people's capacities better, turning better skills into better jobs and better lives. That's why we should see, technology, at least for those with the right skills, as a huge enabler and a utilizer of human capacity. I also want to show you one thing, where people work in technology-intensive kind of workplaces, you are more likely to learn from your co-workers. We have more social, more collaborative environments. You are more likely to learn by doing. You just figure out things by yourself because the technology environment allows you to do that. You are a lot more likely to keep up to date. So again, we should look at those future workplaces as the great enabler of lifelong learning. Unfortunately, that is not currently translating into numbers of learners, particularly not of those who are most at risk of losing their jobs. If we know that 20 years from now there's not going to be a truck driver left, what are we going to do today to actually help those people get to the next layer? And I must say there's a lot, I think, to be done. It's also the nature of learning. We used to learn to do the work, and suddenly learning has become the work. Now, this idea that you can go to school and to university, you do your job and you retire, that's completely out of date. What's become a lot more important is the red part, very early years. Many of the workplace skills that we value most in adult life, whether it's curiosity, whether it's courage, whether it's empathy, collaboration, we build them best in the very first years of our lives. And then comes schooling, tertiary education, university. It's going to be a lot more integrated. This dichotomy between career and technical education and academic learning has no place in the world in which we live. And then learning and working are one of the same things. Good places of work will always be good places of learning. That's the transition. Technology gives us the tool for this. New learning experiences, technology can make your learning so much more granular, so much more adaptive, so much more interactive, so much more interesting. Why would you, learn about the results of an experiment when you can do that experiment in a virtual laboratory? Eric, you highlight the part of assessment. Very important. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we made in education ever was to divorce learning and assessment. Now we basically have people stacking up years of education, and then we say, come back and tell me everything that you have learned in a very contrived kind of artificial environment. And that leaves many people frustrated. And actually that leaves many people not wanting to go back to education because they associate it with someone is going to watch this. Now with technology, we can reintegrate learning and assessment. While you learn, you're going to get that feedback. That kind of interaction is so important. The blockchain technology will break the monopoly of those large education providers. It's going to give people ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. I think that's the future. But I want to finish with a few questions that I think we need to look at when we study adult learning. The first is an obvious one. How do we share the costs and benefits between individuals, employers, and governments? At the moment, all of the financing is front-loaded because we know those institutions. There's very little money going into adult learning. How do we, change that equation? People obviously need to shoulder more of that burden. Employers, probably also, tax incentives will be important. Governments, should think more about what people know and can do rather than, the credits they accumulate in certain ways. Who sets the standards for that learning, particularly when it's not provided in formal institutions? How do we recognize the skills? For me, that's actually one of the most tricky questions that we need to work out. At the moment, the whole education industry is highly monopolistic. You have a few kind of institutions that basically own the way in which we accredit learning, and everybody is watching what they do, and that has a huge ripple-down effect up to primary education. How do we move to more kind of granular, adaptive ways of certifying skills in the digital world? Some industries, figure that out for themselves, micro-credentials, but we need a stronger currency, a currency that is more transversal, that is more portable, that allows people, to learn, to choose where they want to learn, and to get recognized for this. I think that's one of the biggest steps in front of us, much bigger than, just creating learning opportunities. How do we deal with people outside companies? For the unemployed, you can say, well, governments should pick up the bill and the training. I think that's working in most systems. But more important are the people who are going to be at risk of automation. And we can predict, we know who those people are, we know their work. And at the moment, we're seeing very, very little initiative. Everybody pushes that on to someone else. How do we deal with people who want to change their jobs? How do we deal with people in the gig economy that are much harder to locate, much harder to provide incentive support for people? But I think that's one of the questions, if you want to address lifelong learning, you will have to address that. And then, the issues of governance. New forms of work often mean we don't know how to tax this, and that means raising resources. We have shifting demographics that, shift public spending more into the past, and we have less money for the future, like skills. I think it's a real issue in many, many countries. We have, an increasing, decentralization of information flows. That means it's harder for people to keep track of, skills. We have a weakening link between formal education and jobs. Personally, I think that's a good thing. It's opening a lot of doors for a lot of people, but we need to deal with that in a more conscious way. Last but not least, and that's my concluding thought, the biggest worry that we need to have is that the people who need the training most are getting the least out of it. And that's something that you can see in the United States, but in virtually every other country, except, maybe Norway or Sweden. Now there you basically have reasonable levels of continuing education for everybody. But in most countries, at the moment, if we're honest, we invest in the highly skilled to get lifelong learning, while the people who need it most get the least out of it. Well, I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Andreas, that's super helpful, and super helpful context on both who needs, when we sort of think about if we're building tools and technologies, who needs it? I think that's important. And this idea that what are the jobs to be done is changing. And this idea that, these are global trends, that potentially something you're doing in one place could be relevant to another. One thing that I would sort of add in is I sometimes think that we make category distinctions between children and adults, but some of the same things that we can learn around the science of learning, how do you improve human performance, could apply both at the K-12 level and in lifelong learning approaches. So how do you do rapid skill acquisition? And so part of the reason why we built this as a track for the tools competition this year was to be more of a conversation between, what does the best of learning science give us, and how do we use it, at all sort of age groups. So super interesting. What I would love to do, as our next step is take some of the provocative questions that Andreas has given us, as well as kind of a sense of this dynamic landscape, and invite Katie Knight, who I think is going to be leading a panel discussion. And I'll give it to her to welcome her fellow panelists. But thank you, Andreas, for getting us going.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kumar, and hi, everyone. I'm excited to be moderating this panel with Maria Flynn, President and CEO of Jobs for the Future, and British Robinson, who's the Executive Director, President and CEO of Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. I'll invite them both to introduce themselves momentarily and ask them a question to kick us off. I think given the amount of time that we have, I do want to jump right into talking about what we're here to talk about, which is the impact of the pandemic and the future landscape of tools for adult learners and reskilling in the space. So I think if I could ask you, British, to introduce yourself and maybe start by just telling us your initial thoughts on what you think we should be concerned with as it relates to the pandemic and the impact on the job landscape, and maybe what you're excited to talk about with Maria and I in this moment.
Sure. Thanks. It's good to see everybody. So I really appreciate the keynote speakers' comments. You know, where I want to sort of situate maybe the conversation, and I think Maria will come in and talk a little bit more about the job piece, but if we take a step back and really think about the pipeline or the population that's most at risk that was just mentioned, and those most or the lowest skills folks who are likely to have access to the things that they need. Just here in the US, I mean, our data is based off of OECD data, but just to resituate us, 54% of US adults ages 16 to 74 essentially read below a 6th grade level. I'm gonna say that again. 54% of adults in the US, which is 130 million adults, essentially read below a 6th grade level. Well, you cannot have if you can't read, you can't have digital literacy skills, and you can't thereby get into the job market. You can't read a ballot, you can't fill out a job application, and as we heard earlier from Eric, you can't read to your child. This is a multi-generational problem. It's been exacerbated by COVID. We know that a mother's education level is the single greatest determinant of her child's academic success. So these are critical factors. We know that folks who are at this low level of reading, we have to be able to push them up the ladder and up the pipeline so that they can get into jobs. In order to do that, we can't just say, okay, you just need these digital literacy skills. It goes back to the keynote speaker. We've got to look at meeting the adult learner where they are, wherever they are. And I think EdTech has a moment, which we'll come back to in a minute, but to meet them where they are, we have to fundamentally deal with the low level of literacy, first and foremost, so that we can push that pipeline up. In order to do that, EdTech has a critical role. That's kind of the upside of COVID. And that upside is that in a strange way, it's been this equalizer for all of us, but an equalizer because parents, whether they're low literate or educated through high school or college, they've realized, wait a minute, I'm seeing my own problem, my own low literacy or low skills problem through the lens of my child. And that has become a forcing function. So how do we, all of us as a community, use this forcing function, or I like to say the opportunity of COVID, the positive side of COVID, to bring these people into the fold to get them sort of upskilled, whatever level that they're at. So we did a Gallup study about a year ago with Gallup, and we looked at the economy. It was the first ever study that was done, which I was shocked by. I have a deep global health and international background, stunned by it, but no one had correlated low literacy rates, whether they be domestic or international, to the economy. It turns out we're losing about $2.2 trillion, or about 10% of GDP, and that's very conservative every year due to those folks, those over 100 million people who read below a 6th grade level. So this is an economic issue as we think about the pipeline and the upskilling and the truck driver that's not going to be a truck driver that was just mentioned 10 years ago. We've got to go downstream and try to deal with these folks that are not in the economy. A lot of them are in the gig economy or they're outside of the economy. And it's due to the lack of being able to read or have basic literacy skills, reading, writing, and numeracy. And so I just want to make sure that we're all we have that context to get to the point that we were just talking about earlier. And then we can talk about, we have some solutions that we'd love to talk further about, but let me stop there, Katie, if that's helpful, just to frame and situate our context, particularly in the US. If we're that's a third of our population. We're a population of 330 million people. So that it's a clarion call for all of us.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful and I think a really sobering point. And as someone who leads a foundation focused on tech and society, I find that so often myself and my colleagues in the space are thinking about this sort of next level, these digital skills and the future, but we sometimes forget that the basis from which we're operating is one that is already so inequitable and that we have so much to overcome in many ways in order to get to the place where we can start to solve for those next level problems. Mm-hmm. Maria, I know that JFF has been looking at many of these issues from multiple angles across the country. And so I'd love to hear from you sort of in the same vein, what you're excited to talk about today and what your perspective is on the pandemic impact on our conversation.
Sure. So I love kind of where we have started, because I just want to echo, kind of this theme of, what concern I have with how the topic of adult learning often gets discussed in the field as it kind of groups everyone together, right? And I think that it's important for all of us to remember that, I think as a starting point, right, the impact of COVID has varied greatly from individual to individual, right? And we also tend to kind of group the experiences of individuals together. So really stepping back and thinking about how has COVID impacted essential workers, folks whose jobs were, automated away, folks who are kind of starting at a lower skill level. And the same as, as British very eloquently put, I feel this issue of how many adults are reading at a low grade level just rarely gets discussed, like even within federal policy debates. So I think just shining a light on that issue is a great place to start. And then I think on the employer side, I thought one of the last slides we saw from the keynote around, the big disparity between how much on-the-job training you get from your employer, if you are more highly educated versus those who are not. I think the good news is that red dot, which was, I think, hovering somewhere around 20% in the US, 15 years ago, that was probably around 5%. So the good news is at least it is like creeping in the right direction, but still a huge gap. So I think looking at what is the role of the employer in these approaches, what is the appropriate role of the public sector versus the private sector, and how can EdTech almost like serve as a bridge between those sectors, I think is something, interesting that we could dive into. But one last thought on the employer piece, like we have seen in our work, both in the healthcare sector and also in the logistics sector, that when an employer does say, okay, we're going to train our frontline staff and upgrade their skills, they're often struck by the low reading level of the staff. And that's something that they often don't anticipate. It's like, oh, Maria's a great worker. We didn't realize that, she was, had a third grade reading level. And so our approach that we were going to take in terms of reskilling now isn't going to work. So I think the skill level, but really how you do that real-time assessment and real-time kind of mapping of the trajectory is where there's a big gap in the field.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And before we go on, I'll just echo what Meg and Kim have said in the chat, which is that if you have questions in the audience, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll try to integrate them or get to them during the Q&A as we go. So picking up on sort of that last piece there, Maria, when we think about EdTech and the possibilities, and especially as we speak to an audience of folks that we hope will participate in the tools competition, what do we see potentially from EdTech filling those gaps? And how does that look different for adult learners who need reskilling or who need this sort of basic skilling in literacy that we're talking about here too?
Sure. So when I think about this, like I've started talking about this concept of find, finance, and flourish, right? So I think we have challenges with adult learners in each of those areas. So one, just with Credential Engine, their reports say there are about 1 million credentials out there, right? So just the task of navigating kind of this maze of learning opportunities, both the credentials themselves and the providers, how can technology really provide some support around the navigation piece, right? So helping individuals find their path, I also think then there's a financing challenge, right? So the US investment in adult literacy is terribly low. I don't know what the most recent appropriation is, but I think for a while it was hovering somewhere around $600 million for the entire country. So what are other ways that you can finance? So we have the policy debate going on now around should Pell be extended to short-term credentials, looking at different innovative approaches like income share agreements, but how do you help particularly adults with lower skill levels finance their trajectory, and what is the role of the employer in that? And then this idea of flourishing. And so I think EdTech also has a role to play in terms of helping to kind of navigate the support services that are needed. I know that there's a company, Equity, that's looking at the need for emergency aid and how you disperse that to individuals. So I think those wraparound supports are also a place that technology can play a big role.
British, if you have anything to add on that piece, I welcome your input as well. I'd also add perhaps for you a bit of a spin, which is as you think about the future and the potential for EdTech tools as compared to traditional post-secondary, where I think we've seen, for example, in the community college space, how much money we spend on remediation to address some of these same issues that you've brought up. What do you think the future might look like there for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that Maria sort of touched on around, EdTech as the equalizer. I think the first thing is to go back a little bit to a stat, which is currently today, services or traditional services, meaning classroom-based, or you go to a church basement, or you go to a school after work, you're in the gig economy, you've worked 3 jobs already. Now, in order to upskill, whether you're at, 6th grade level, 5th grade, whatever your grade level is, you're having to manage all of this. And so if we can get more tools out there that meet the adult learner where they are, so that they can use and learn in real time. And I'll talk about some lessons, but one thing is adults learn differently than children do. You have to embed adult learning theory into the actual tools. This is a big deal for EdTech. Some of the EdTech tools that have been put on the market haven't been that successful because they haven't inculcated or embedded adult learning theory. So you actually meet the adult where they are, you make the learning and the curriculum more relevant to where they are. You ensure that the learner has what we call micro lessons. So you can learn, you might be able to get your GED in 15-minute increments over a year instead of having to sit in a classroom, right? So that's responding in some ways to the global economy, but also to what the employer may need. So whether you're moving up the chain at a large employer or you're shifting to a whole nother industry, if we can embed that kind of sort of technology into the tool, we'd be a lot better off. And I think that's the missing gap, but also that's the opportunity. If we can actually pair the EdTech community with the adult learning community, lifelong community, we're going to see better outcomes ultimately. I mean, just to look at the outcome, if we can upskill somebody with a micro lesson tool, I was telling you about the study we did. If we can move everybody up to 6th grade level, your annual income is $64,000 a year. If you're between 3rd grade and 5th grade, your annual income is $48,000. If you're at 3rd grade or below, your income is half of that. It's $34,000. So there's a real quantifiable economic impact if we can inculcate and embed some good things inside of these tools. We learned a lot about 2-4 years ago. Kumar and I were talking about this, but we invested in X Prize competition, right? We put money on the table and we said, go out and build some adult literacy apps. Well, we learned a lot from that. Then the other thing is that some of our teachers in this space, they themselves don't have digital literacy skills. So that's impeding the actual learner. The other thing is huge shame and stigma. So if you're in a work environment and your employer may offer a program, you don't want your other employees, your other colleagues to know that you're at a lower grade level. So again, huge opportunity right now for EdTech, but we have to embed that. I do want to say something about assessments, because you were talking about the tools. One of the things, not only do we want to make it appropriate, engaging, meeting the adult learner where they are, we also want to make sure that the teacher is equipped, because many are not, and they're not credentialed. It's not like K-12. K-12, we don't have teachers in our third grade classrooms that don't have credentials. All of our most of our lifelong learning teachers are not credentialed. There are no national standards. So we need to look at this structurally and systemically as well on that level. And then behavior and learning analytics. This is absolutely critical when we talk about assessment. One of the things that's not been embedded or not fully realized is that we have to look at decision-making, instructional design, and support for the learner in real time, not outputs, but outcomes. We have to identify those needs in real time. So in the health space, we now have personalized learning. Personalized health. We need to look at personalized learning because a lot of what we're doing is output-based, but did the person actually learn to read? Do they know how to turn on the app? Do they have those digital literacy skills to manage their role? So that's the opportunity moment if we all really focus on not just the tool and the shiny object, but how are we proving that we're actually going to have impact and see outcomes? And then we'll actually start to ladder people up and we'll start to see that job situation change and that truck driver move to the role that we think they can get to.
Yeah, I think those are hugely important points. Maria, was there something else that you wanted to add there as we think about, I think just to add on to the question, the hopes that we have for filling in some of the gaps, the missing pieces in the tools and tech that exist for adult learners?
Yes, I think one is I think there's two ways to think about the customer, so to speak, right? So what are the tools that individuals themselves can access? And what are the tools that are needed to kind of build the capacity of the public systems, right? So the folks who are working, in the adult literacy programs, in the workforce, career centers across the country, kind of enhancing the ability of those case managers and counselors to help individuals as well. So it's almost like you have like individual facing tools that are needed and kind of system facing digital transformation enhancements that are also needed.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And it serves as a bridge, I think, to sort of the next couple of questions, which are a little more focused, I think, on the competitors and the tools competition more specifically and what competitors should be thinking about. So I feel like you've made a great point, Maria, about sort of the different customers that exist, the different addressable markets that there are. What we saw in the last round of the tools competition that I judged was that there are opportunities to do things that don't always look the way you might expect them to look in terms of they focus on individual learners and touch those learners with a tool and we're rolling along, right? There are enabling functions. There are other pieces of the puzzle to solve for. So as you think about what you'd like to see perhaps competitors in the tools competition consider or focus on when they're developing their ideas or key pitfalls that they might avoid when they're developing these ideas, what comes to mind for you on that?
What I would say is, maybe this is stating the obvious, but really keeping the end user in mind and keeping an equity kind of frame at the focus, right? So really thinking about how the individual is going to utilize these tools, how it's going to kind of fit into their, everyday life. And so knowing that a lot of adult learners obviously are dealing with just an overall lack of time, competing demands of work and family and education, and how you kind of are designing around that reality at the center, I think is really important. And then to me, I think a pitfall that I have seen at times is when EdTech is trying to almost like replicate or duplicate the effort of something that really already kind of exists in the system or the public system. And I would say instead to focus on how you enhance those systems, right? Because I think we're at this moment where, especially with so many dollars that are going to be coming out of DC, how do we like enhance the like utilization and the consumability, I guess, of these resources? And so to me, that's where there's a big gap in the system, is making those resources more really like consumer friendly and helping individuals like make the best decisions that they can regarding their kind of education and career pathway with those resources.
British, would you add there?
Yeah, I would just say ditto 100% what Maria said. I would just emphasize the micro lessons are really important. It's a pedagogy that's absolutely critical. That would be the number one thing. And the second thing that we learned from the communities competition is, and Maria touched on this, but is the convenience of the adult learners, you know, sort of busy life, but also you need a trusted ombudsman almost. Sometimes in communities, that one-on-one piece, here's the technology, please try this out. When you pilot, make sure that you're actually piloting with adult learners, you know, not a kind of proxy for them, because that's been done. And you want to look at community-based organizations. So typically your religious or your faith-based groups or churches, or, you know, the local YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club, or somewhere where the community kind of converges. They can become your ombudsman, and they will make the product, the exercise, the study, the pilot much more rigorous and frankly successful. And they will bridge the on-ramp, because there's a lot of lack of trust, right, in many communities or amongst low learners or adult learners. And so you need them to be that ombudsman. Those are two key examples. And again, make sure that your teachers are credentialed, and if they're not credentialed, that they themselves are equipped to actually teach the tool, whatever that tool may be, whether it's gaming or traditional or what have you. So I think those are critical things to think about as you go into the competition.
I think that's really important advice for the competition and beyond, for anyone who's running programs or developing tools in this space at all. As we begin to move toward the Q&A and I try to integrate some of the questions from the audience, one thing that has come up is, you know, are there successful tools or strategies that you've seen to integrate literacy skills into job training that you would highlight for folks on the Zoom today?
Yeah, the one I would highlight, and this was one of the winners of the Wage Gain Challenge that we ran 2 years ago with support from Schmidt Futures, is CELED. I know there might be folks from CELED on the line, but I really think, to me, they really stand out in terms of serving, you know, adults at lower literacy levels, and this combination of, you know, the kind of the, as you're saying, kind of the microbursts of learning in their model, the accessibility of it, and also combining, you know, kind of some life coaching on the platform as well. So they definitely stand out to me. And then another competition that is, I think it's coming to a close, but something to look at, is it's the New Profit and X Prize competition called the Future of Work Grand Challenge. JFF is a partner in that as well, but they have, I think it's 10 solutions that are currently part of that challenge. So just some other interesting lessons coming out of that in real time.
Yeah, Katie, I would just add to that. So CELED is a partner of ours as well. We invested in them. They were a promising app and tool out of the X Prize competition, and we're still partnering with them across the country. What I want to highlight, you're asking about the key fit there beyond the micro lessons, is the mentorship. So there's an 800 number, so you can actually have one-on-one sort of tutoring or a buddy, if you will. We know for adult learners, and this is part of adult learner theory, is that having a buddy or mentor beside you will bring about success faster and more efficiently, and we'll see those outcomes that we're all seeking when we're looking to move people into the workforce or up the ladder. So critical on mentorship, and not just leaving somebody with the tool themselves, but having a cadre, if you will, of mentors or buddies. That's absolutely critical. And then the second tool we would highlight is something was our winner of our X Prize, which was called, at the time, called Codex. We partnered with SMU, Southern Methodist University. We're now on phase 2, if you will. It's a game, so it's teaching adults in lifelong learning through gaming. It's now called Enigma. We're really excited about this game, but we've kind of done all the right things through some of the lessons learned, and we're about to go into a feasibility study this fall, and then we hope to fully pilot at the top of 2022. So stay tuned. We'll happily keep you guys posted on enigma, but it's really the first of its kind for adult learners, and particularly moving people up the ladder and getting them into the workforce or either upskilled.
Really great examples and points. As we come to the closing or near to the closing here, one more question that I bring in from the audience. If learning is the work, as we heard in our keynote, is learning to learn a basic skill for all workers, for all people, what does that look like? What does that mean to you? Is learning to learn a basic skill alongside the other basic skills that we're talking about?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's going to be increasingly true given the rate of change in the labor market and the increasing rate of automation. I also think another skill is the skill of like navigating your path, right? How you kind of take in that information, how you make the best informed decisions. I would add that to the list as well.
Katie, maybe just a different tack, but I want to make sure I mentioned this before we close, which is, again, why EdTech and why now? There is a moment, and we need EdTech in the adult learner space, regardless of level that we're talking about. It is absolutely critical. What it's going to do for us right now in this moment of COVID and beyond is, one, is it's going to create more supply. So there's 2 million people that are currently getting services right now, federal dollar services around the country to learn, get their high school diploma, GED, et cetera. 2 million. I just told you over 100 million are below 6th grade level. How are we going to bridge the gap? EdTech is the answer to bridge the gap. The second thing is, because of COVID, because parents are seeing their own lack of skills through their children's eyes, I can do better. I'm now in a community of more people. In a weird way, it's kind of lessened the shame. How do we take advantage of that moment and create more demand, but go grab that demand with EdTech tools that are balanced, that meet that learner where they are, wherever they are. So those two things I just wanted to point out before we close, because I think are absolutely critical. Why EdTech, why now? And these two sectors really need to join together. And we know how to do it, I think, out of the last sort of 2 to 5 years, but also the pandemic positively is pushing us together. And can we take advantage of the moment?
I think that is a really, really great point, and brings us sort of back to where we started, which is we have a moment of opportunity if we choose to take it, to turn what has been a horrible experience in so many ways, an experience that has highlighted so many of the fundamental inequities in our society that we're still struggling to address, and create new solutions that hopefully will bring people forward in a way that allows them to participate more fully in the gains of the innovation economy and in the gains of the economy more broadly. So I think that's a really great note to end on. And I'm incredibly grateful to both of you for being a part of this conversation today. Really hopeful about what will come out of the tools competition. And thank you everyone for listening in. And I think I've ended right on time. Have I not, Kumar?
You did great. You guys are, I could listen to you guys for a lot longer. I think it was like huge pearls of wisdom. Yeah, so just, we're running really well on schedule. We got just a couple of minutes. I want to do a couple of things as we close out. So first, I just wanted to sort of thank our incredible speakers, starting with Eric Braverman, Andreas, British, Maria, and Katie. It was actually really interesting because I think the wealth of expertise in a short period of time, all of you are leaders who've actually been kind of doing the work, and actually all of you have been, not taking the status quo as a given, which is that we have to really invest in new models, and a number of you have tried and have learned a lot from that. Like what's working, what else needs to happen. So I actually was, as I was hearing it, I was like picking up all these, like, we tried this, but then we realized this was a key gap that needed to be built in. So I would really recommend for folks listening to like both follow up but also like, there's a lot to be building on from previous efforts in building really compelling tools and technology in this area. But I would also take the idea that there's a ton of encouragement. You didn't hear people saying, well, I think we got this problem licked, or the whole technology is all figured out. So I want to just incredibly thank this incredible list of speakers for joining us. A couple of other things I wanted to do was just, say that, this is the first of our series. And so we're going to have another one of this in a week on the 14th. That one will be a deep dive on assessment. Assessment came up a bunch in this conversation, but as folks might not know, the global landscape for assessment is like radically changing. A whole bunch of tests actually got pulled down because a lot of testing is actually in person. And so there's a big conversation happening on what is the assessment landscape we need to build towards, and that'll be our next conversation. The thing I wanted to do was just, you heard it a ton from Katie and others, which is, I really encourage you to check out the tools competition as a place where you can apply. We're going to have a information session that'll start right at 1 o'clock Eastern time as a follow-on from this conversation for folks who want to stick around. But my sort of argument for why you should check it out is basically threefold. First is we explicitly created the tools competition so that we're not just talking about the problem, we're actually working on it. So it's a very active new model. Last year, we got a ton of interest, and that's why I worked hard with folks like Katie and others to recruit a lot more capital. So we've got more than $3 million of awards, which is more than double what we had last year. But we also have stocked it full of peers and funders. So some of them might see interesting ideas that come through the tools competition that they might support or be able to give good advice to anyway. And one of the best pieces of feedback we got about the first year is people really appreciated going through the process itself because we've built in a lot of feedback along the way. And so whether you're a final winner or not, it's actually a really important way to get feedback from your peers. And the final thing I'll just say is that we've made it such that it's phased. So putting together a phase 1 application is just a couple of pages. And we've got different levels for, is this a totally crazy new idea or is it something already with traction? So we want to lower the barrier to entry. And so I really hope folks step up. And I was really excited about how many, an individual teacher that had a crazy idea that submitted, students that submitted, people who have been thinking about an idea and sort of really stepped up, as well as larger companies who've been working on this. And finally, I'll just sort of, end with what was the thesis behind why we sort of think about this as a learning engineering strategy, which is just that I just don't think we're at the end of history when it comes to like building really good systems for improving adult learning. And I thought British's point about how much need there is for basic skills training just sort of should suggest to us that where and how much direct resources there are, how much opportunity there is for work. So I want to thank everybody and thank everyone for joining us. And if folks are interested in sticking around, we'll welcome them to stick around for the learning agency team and our competition organizers to be able to answer any of your questions. Thanks, everybody. And let me pass it to Meg for our follow-on. It's not after hours, but for our follow-on Q&A. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kumar. Great, well, we'll give everyone just a minute for those folks who are leaving us to sign off. And thanks to all of you who are staying. We're excited to kind of follow up on that exciting conversation and talk a little bit more about the specifics for the tools competition specifically. So, Kara, if you can just, great, perfect. So, we're thrilled that there are so many people who are staying on. I think we've had the opportunity to connect with many of you through a networking session, through informational webinars, as well as on one-on-one calls. And, I think there's been overwhelming interest in the competition this year. And we've heard just fantastic ideas from those of you who we've had the opportunity to connect with. I think last year, the reason the competition was such a success was because all the competitors put an enormous amount of time and energy into the process. And while competitions have to name winners, the goal is really to support everyone who's participating and to create community and help everyone move their ideas forward. So, at every point of this process, we're really here to answer questions, be a sounding board, connect you with other partners if possible. So we really we're excited to have this be an opportunity to connect, share with others who are potentially participating. But following this conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly at the tools competition email address, which we'll drop in the chat. So I think many of you already know a lot about the overall competition, but we just want to kind of give a brief overview of the highlights for those of you with less information. So, a couple of quick competition facts. As Kumar mentioned, the competition is designed to be inclusive of all different people who are interested in this space. So we have 2 prize bands. The prize band, the lower prize band is really designed for people who are new to the field or who have an idea that is just getting off the ground. The larger prize band is meant for people who have a platform or an idea that already has some traction. This conversation really focused on one of the 4 priority areas of the competition on adult learning. We have 3 other priority areas that we are eager to hear ideas and innovative proposals across all of those. I think there's a lot of questions of, can your proposals cross-cut multiple? And I think many of these do blend together. So absolutely, but we really recommend that you do target your proposal to one or multiple to be most competitive. And we can definitely talk more about this, but all proposals are generally evaluated against 5 key criteria. And so we are, happy to work with you to figure out how to best highlight and integrate that, or shine a light on how you're addressing those in your proposal. So, this competition this year really builds on the excitement of last year as well. And so, as Kumar mentioned, we are thrilled to have more sponsors this year. And that is allowing us to award more prizes, which we're really thrilled about. I want to hand it over to questions in just a second. I think, we are just about 3 weeks out from the deadline to submit proposals for the first phase of the competition. But as Kumar mentioned, the competition is a phased process. So at each point, we kind of ask you to add more to your proposal and provide additional feedback and support to help you build out your idea and your team. The initial proposal that's due October 1st is a really light lift. So we really welcome all of you who might be thinking that it's a short timeline. Take a look at the form, and it's just about 1 to 2 pages, depending on your answers. So I'll stop there, and we'll open this up for questions for a short period of time, and then with the additional time, we'll break people out into smaller groups to have the opportunity to talk to other potential competitors and to get feedback from them as well. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if there aren't questions, we will move right into networking. Great. I'm seeing a question from Sam. Sam, do you want to share that question out loud?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was just curious, earlier in the session, we heard that about 900 people applied last year. So I was just curious, based on maybe the applications last year or what your expectations are for this year, about what percentage do you think are going to make it through phase 1?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do not set a specific number because we're doing it, the proposals that move from phase 1 to phase 2 are the ones that we think are well aligned and have a really good chance to be competitive in phase 2. For specific stats of those 900 proposals from phase 1 last year, about 700 moved to phase 2.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then I'm seeing a question from Lewis Johnson. Do you want to share that question out loud?
Yeah, so given that learning engineering is fundamental to the whole program, I'm curious as to why you have research tools as a separate track? And following that, how do we decide whether something is in that track as opposed to the adult learning track?
Yeah, so I think there's two questions there. One, kind of what are the what does the research platform track look like? And the second question I heard was largely about kind of how to decide which track you're most competitive for and which you should target. So the first question, I think the research tools track is really looking for tools that are helping to facilitate learning science research. So this can look different than a tool that is willing to share their data for research. So, there's a number of tools, and some of these examples are on the, or will soon be on the website, that help facilitate A/B testing, RCTs. And so we are, those platforms don't necessarily have to have the same they don't necessarily have to have the same types of engagement and learning objectives as a potential tool that would accelerate learning for that track or would support adult learning. And then I think the second question on how to pick the right track, again, a lot of these tracks blend together, but I think you are welcome in the first phase to select multiple. And then from phase 1 to phase 2, we will kind of help you decide which is the track that you're most competitive in, so that by track 2, you'll be focusing on one of those.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I see Anita, I just wanted to follow up that the overall question. Oh, yeah, it was 700 of 900. Great. So I think we are just about out of questions. Again, there's absolutely the opportunity to continue to ask questions by emailing us and having one-on-one conversations with us. But we have a lot of people here who are interested, and one of the things that we've heard is really valuable is the opportunity to connect with more people and hear about other people's ideas. So what we'd like to do for the next 20 minutes is probably have about 2 breakout groups. And so our team will work with you. We'll basically send you a link to join a networking group, and you'll just have to press the button to join that group. And then we encourage you to work within that team to share your names, your interests, what you're potentially driving for in the competition, and get feedback from that group. And then we will shift that in probably 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how the conversations are going. So with that, I just thank you all so much. And we will kind of pop in and out of the conversations to support the brainstorming.